don't we? Thank you to Rob and all of the team who make sure that that happens. Edith and Randy, we have a little thank you for you that you can open later, but I will tell you that it contains some seeds, some columbine seeds.
Oh, nice.
The state flower of Colorado. It's we presented Randy and Edith with the prayer shawls on Friday night, and just one more little going away gift.
Not too late to plant those in Oregon either. So.
Is it? Okay, good. Now, some of us, many of us, have been present to hear you this weekend and know something of this. But for those who weren't able to, I wondered if we could start with the question that Krista Tippett often starts with when she interviews guests. Can you tell us something about the spiritual landscape of your childhood? What it was like for you growing up?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for this Oprah moment. This might be the closest I can.
I'll be Oprah any day.
Okay. Let's see. My parents are from the South. They went up with the Great Migration during they went up twice. They went up, went back, and then came back again. But with a lot of the poor folks in the South, black, native, poor white people, etc., because what had happened after World War II, they turned all the bomber plants and things into automobile factories, and so my dad went up, worked for an automobile factory. My mother is I'm a third generation people who've been coal miners, but I'm the first generation to not be in the coal mines. My grandfather died of black lung. My great-grandfather died in a mining accident, and I'm thankful that I wasn't the third generation. Yeah, and so we, they're both mixed blood Cherokees. Grew up knowing about my native identity, and one of my ancestors, who was a chief named Woodley, his name is translated Big Acorn. In Cherokee, we have a lot of vegetable names. So not like my wife, one of her family names is jumps on him and kills him. So I guess we grew a lot of corn and squash and pumpkins. So, I just think I decided at an early age. They were all pretty assimilated, and all their friends at our church were the same thing. A lot of mixed blood people, Shawnee, Muskogee, Choctaw, and I guess I decided about 10 years old that I didn't want to be one of these kind of part Indians that sits around and talks about their grandmother spoke the language and all this, and it kind of went on a quest from that point on to say, well, how do I be a real Indian? So I was just this, young kid who was like, on this quest, and that led me to find out a lot more about my own ancestry. Hang out with a lot of Indian folks throughout my life, and that's been rewarding because I was able to begin to think in ways different than I think the dominant culture expected us to think. And so, I grew up in a pretty rough place, very multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, near Detroit, called Ypsilanti, Michigan, and the bad part of that was called Willow Run, Michigan, and so those were pretty mean streets, and but I learned a lot there too. So I'm about to become a PhD eventually, and a professor is about as far away as you can get from where I came from. So,
thank you, Randy. This weekend, you have often talked about the land and how the land is really primary to your worldview, to your identity. And you make the distinction, which I love, between living with the land and living on the land. You describe yourself as living with the land. So can you tell us more about Eloheh, your nonprofit in Oregon, and am I pronouncing it correctly?
Pretty much, yeah. Eloheh.
Okay. I looked it up.
Okay. So we started in 1998 with a vision. And we'd been working among our Native people for years and serving in all kinds of ways. We did after-school programs for kids. We did powwows. We did sweat lodge. We did summer basketball leagues. We did Indian youth culture camp. We did language programs. We did feeding programs, food closets, baby needs closets, baby needs Christmas, parenting classes. I think we've done it all. Houseless, service to houseless people. But we realized that the goal of the government and the church was to make Native people dependent on them. And that robs us of our dignity and our agency. And so our whole thing was like, how do we do this and empower our people and give them agency? And so I think that was answered in 1998 in a dream I had. And that dream, I saw this vision of a place that was a school and a sustainable regenerative farm and a community and a place where we could practice our ceremonies unmolested. And we spent 4 years trying to find that. Finally found it, and after 2 years, a group of white supremacists, Christian nationalists, tried to drive us off with a .50 caliber machine gun. And so we eventually decided that it wasn't worth somebody getting killed over. And so we began to think about moving. And from this vision, we had 50-acre farm and school and community and elders. And, we were producing probably 75-80% of our own food. We had cattle, horses, sheep, goats, chickens, rabbits, ducks, guineas, you name it, and all heritage breeds, by the way. And then we had to give all that up after 4 years. And there's a lot more to the story. We had to move our kids to a different school district and everything else to keep from getting picked on all the time. But anyway, we sort of lost everything and then moved to Oregon, and I worked as a half-time professor for a couple of years, then three-quarter time, then full-time, and then became distinguished and tenured, and now I'm emeritus. So I climbed that mountain and didn't really enjoy it that much. I had my own ideas of the pedagogy and the way that we should be doing things, and that was the vision of the original Aloh. So we were able to purchase a small 3-acre farm and try to replicate that, and it just wasn't the right place for it. It was too small. But we learned a lot about farming. And then eventually, a couple things happened, and then we eventually moved about 30 minutes away from that place to another farm out in a 10-acre farm. And now we have sort of that whole original vision going again now. So we've been there for 4 years. And this year we're having our whole spring and summer are full of schools, and our farm's doing well, and we've got a seed company now, and so everything's going really well. And that's called Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Eloheh Farm Seeds. And so it's a farm, it's a school, it's a demonstration community, it's a community, it's a place for us to practice our ceremonies and all of that. So took a little while to get there, but
yeah. And by the way, Lisa and I plan to come visit y'all this summer, so we'll bring back more information about that. Really looking forward to that. Are you in favor of land acknowledgement statements, or what are your feelings about that?
I have a lot of feelings about that. I think it's a good first step in building a relationship with the local people. Otherwise, it just becomes sort of ethereal. And I'm not sure there's any point in that except for to make ourselves feel good. So if it's like this is our first step or one of the steps in getting to know more about the indigenous people of this land, in respecting the fact that this is their land, in perhaps forming a committee that says, how do we become in relationship with the people? And they all the tribes have events and, you know, websites and cultural events, and, you know, otherwise I'd say just put it on a sign, you know, and that would work, you know. You know, I think we've been getting asked this almost everywhere we've gone for the last 3 or 4 years. And in Canada, you know, that was part of one of the remedies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, I talked to my friends up there, and they're just like, you know, this gets repetitive and doesn't seem to mean anything. And so it has to be seen as part of a process, I think. So, an educational process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's just my opinion. I may be wrong.
That's what I'm asking you for. I appreciate it, yeah.
There's other people that have other opinions.
I'm not sure it's a right or wrong thing at all, but we're interested in hearing your thoughts on it. Today in worship, of course, we had communion, and before I reached out to you and said, do you want to officiate together? And you said, you know, it's okay. And I so respected and appreciated your honesty, because I never want anyone to do anything that they can't bring their full integrity to, you know. But you said something like, we have other things that we do now, and I'm just interested in what ritual is important to you.
Well, I have, you know, daily stuff that I do when I get up in the morning and pray with water, and because that's our Cherokee way, is to go to the river or creek and begin to pray and sing and pray, and most often Edith's still asleep and I'm in there in the bathroom, because we don't have a creek on our property, and I'm not sure I'd want to go out there these days anyway, but you know, I use the water and I pray and, you know, sing to myself or hear the song in my head, the morning song, you know, and that's personal. And then, you know, I've been given a lot of ceremonies, and we've been running Sweat Lodge I've been running Sweat Lodge for probably like 35 years. And Edith's been running for about 25 maybe. And so that always forms a native community when you have a sweat ceremony. And there are other things, but yeah, we have, like we just had the blessing of the seed ceremony right before we left. It's just a lot of things, but the ceremonies and those practices, if you will, that's not our spirituality. That's what reminds us that we're spiritual people, right? And that we're connected to other people, and connected to all people and all things. And so our spirituality is really what we live. That's who we are, right? So, yeah.
Your writing, I've read several of your books, as many of us have, and I've learned so much about just beginning to unpack what you call the Western worldview and the contrast with Indigenous. And in your book, you describe Western worldview as being characterized by kind of a focus on duality, winning and losing. And I wonder if the Indigenous perspective can offer any advice for us as we face the presidential election coming up. I know that the stakes feel very, very high, and help.
Yeah. Well, old native wisdom says don't vote for Trump. So, that's an ancient saying, I think. Yeah, I think I mentioned last night that we were yesterday or sometime. As long as we have a two-party system, which is not, I think it's a terrible system. It's always going to be the lesser of two evils, you know. So in our Indigenous way, it would be a much more process, much more consensus, and probably formally on a national level, something more like, representative government of some kind. Yeah, it's difficult to know so much about all of them and then say, well, I'm voting for that person, right? But it's just, you have to choose the lesser of two evils. That's the bottom. I mean, I used to vote my conscience, and I would vote for, Green Party and Ralph Nader and other people. But I realized in this system, you're just throwing your vote away. So people don't care. It's not making a statement. It's just, and so until we remedy that, it just has to be for the person who will cause the least amount of damage and maybe do the most good. So.
Yeah. I just have a couple of more questions, and then we'll open it up. So be thinking of the questions that you have. Can you speak to what your understanding is of the function or the purpose of story? You described, I love the slide that you showed where the Bible is 90% story, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding between what most Western people understand as story and what Indigenous people understand as story. So the question most often, and we've seen this in elementary schools, even with little kids and all that, is the first question is the story true? The people who wrote the stories in Scripture, the people who wrote our stories and are told our stories, etc., and told the ones in Scripture, by the way, too, because they were all oral, right, at one point, never intended, I don't think, for that question to be asked. That's a very Western, oriented question about, can I prove that this happened? And so, on one side you get conservative people going, we want to prove that, they walked through the Red Sea, and on the other side you get progressive people saying, things like, no, that was the Sea of Reeds, and it was 2 feet deep, and the wind blew, and both of those are really asking the wrong question. The question isn't, is the story true? The story is, what's the truth in the story? And that's how Indigenous people who write stories or who tell stories, they're telling them because there's a truth in the story, not because whether the story is true or not. So I think that's the main difference. Yeah.
And as you say, it's all oral tradition as it starts, and so oral tradition changes naturally as the times change, as people evolve. The stories change with it until you write them down, and then they're set in stone like the Bible.
Yeah, there's something about that writing that kind of throws the monkey wrench in the gears, so to speak.
Yeah, adds a sense of inflexibility.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, I just have one more question. As I told you, in January, our congregation met every day on Zoom from 8 to 8:15 in the morning, and we went through one of your pages on becoming rooted, which is 100 days.
So nice.
A lot of people wanted to keep going with it, and we ultimately decided, no, let's leave it just for January. But we had the idea last night that next January, we'll pick up number 32 on, and we'll, over 3 years, we'll get through it all the way.
Yeah.
But I can't remember which one, but you referenced at one of those devotionals that you do a pretty good elk bugling imitation. So?
I feel like I'm at the Iowa Fair pig calling contest. Well, I can't do the bugle, but I can do a cow elk. Okay.
We'll take what we can get.
All right. I don't want to blow people away. It's been a while. So
Watch out on the sound, Paul. I think that's good. I have a few.
That's it for me.
Let's all just go home now. Well, it's like a mating call.
We hear a bugle back.
Oh gosh. Rob, shall we open it up and let folks?
So the question I've had listening to you over the weekend is, with all the abuse that Christianity and various interpretations of Christianity have heaped on your people. How did you come to be a pastor and go to seminary and all that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Arda. Thank you. Well, let's see. I was a 19-year-old rock and roll meth-using addict, and one day I couldn't get off of meth, and I just got on my knees and I prayed and I said, you know, God, if you're real, Jesus, if you're real, because I'd been to church when I was younger, take this away from me and I'll follow you the rest of my life. That was my prayer. And I literally woke up from being knocked out. I got up from there and never had the desire to do that again. And I thought, well, this is real. And so that's been my journey. My first couple years, or number of years, was sort of like I was told that my obsession with my native roots was kind of like idolatry. And so I was told to, you know, that I should cut my hair and take those any photographs I have down, I used to get the AIM posters, American Indian Movement, and put up and things, and take all those down because that was of the flesh. Now, I was raised in the Baptist church, right? So when I was younger. So that was kind of par for the course of that era, right? And it took me a few years to climb out of that and realize, like, that's not who I am, and then I've got to figure the rest out. And in 1984 to 86, I went to Alaska as a missionary, and a commissioned missionary at the Kodiak Baptist Mission, which I'm sure you know as a former American Baptist, Jackie. And I spent 2 years in a constant struggle because I felt very much like, you know, my job was a missionary oppressor, and taking away the culture of those kids, and so I sort of had to live a double life almost to relate to them. And I left Alaska and I said, I'm never going to oppress our Native people again. And that's when someone had suggested, well, hey, why don't you go to seminary? And I said, well, what's a seminary? And it sounds like cemetery. You know? I don't want to go there. So they said, well, yeah, there's these cemeteries all over. And I had a scholarship to Vanderbilt, and I got a scholarship to what was then Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, or now Palmer. And I ended up choosing Eastern. And that sort of was my goal, to figure this thing out during my time there. And I came upon the journals of this old Baptist missionary from 1821 to 1870, and he was different than all the rest. And then he had a Cherokee guy with him named Jesse Bushyhead, who was sort of his local guide, if you will. And I noticed he had to do the same thing I did. He would have to like write one thing to the denomination and then act differently. And in those days, it was like he would get in trouble because they would say, it's been told to us or reported to us that you feed and clothe every vagabond Indian who comes to your door. And it's like, oh, isn't that what you're supposed to do? So this Evan Jones had a great effect on my life, and he was a missionary to Cherokee people, but he became trusted and basically even was invited to do some leadership at different times, and eventually was adopted into the nation as a tribal member. So that's pretty unusual. And led one of the parties out on the Trail of Tears as well. So I learned a lot. I read 12 boxes of original journals and letters. There had only been one other person who had ever read them before, and he ended up, his name was William McLaughlin, he's a professor at Brown, and he ended up writing the book before I did. I was going to write a book on it, but might still do that one day. But yeah, I learned there that it's like, so basically how to integrate this thing. And so I went from there to Anadarko, Oklahoma, and began to practice what I'd learned. And so, and then eventually, I know how I became a pastor. That was your question, Ardith. I was a dean of students at Bacone Indian College, and I was busy trying to change the systemic racism there, and they fired me after a couple years of poking the bear, right? And so then it was like, well, now what are you going to do? And someone said, there's this church out in Carson City, Nevada, and you can just kind of go and make it a native church. And so that's how I became a pastor, yeah. And I was a pastor for 7 years. Came back, and then we started our own organization, and that's how Ay-luh-hay eventually came to be. So, yeah. Long answer to a short question, sorry.
Any other questions?
I'm going to stand so I can get stoned for this. Did you know the Ronsavilles on Kodiak Island?
What's that?
Did you know the Ronsavilles?
Did I what?
Know the Ronsavilles, that family? They're Christian workers on Kodiak Island.
What was their last name?
Ronsaville?
No.
Steve Ronsaville, okay. My shackles are always raised when any group or individual is painted with a broad brush as all good or all bad. It seems a form of stereotyping, and it's dehumanizing by the fact that it is. It's stories without nuance, and sometimes it can be demonizing, and I think Indigenous people have felt that with, being called noble savages or vicious savages. But for me, it's also if all Native peoples are kind and peaceful and land-loving, it's still a stereotype and doesn't, I don't think, serve that culture or the rest of us. And so I just wondered how there's been a romanticizing of Indigenous people among some among the hippies in the 60s maybe. And I just would like you to speak to that danger of romanticizing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, we have a lot of stuff, and especially now, and this is part of what Edith and I are do in our schools. We are creating a school now just dealing with Native people and our stuff. It's to me, it's all gradient scale. So, I mean, if you went like it's not, I said a number of times yesterday, it's not utopian, right? But I did show 3 different scientific studies that showed if you went on a gradient scale and talked about things like a more just and harmonious society, and this was the worst and this was the best, our indigenous societies are down here and Western societies are up here. So I think that's provable scientifically, yeah. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for taking my question. So during lecture on Friday night, you talked about Poverty Point, Louisiana. And so I have relatives in that area, and I thought, hey, that'll be a pretty good trip to go down and visit that area. So I did some research, and I learned that it wasn't originally called Poverty Point. So I did a little more research, and it's like they didn't know what it was originally called. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe what it was originally called and how it came to be known as Poverty Point.
I wish I could, but I honestly have no idea. Sorry. But thanks for doing the research. You've probably done more than I have. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Rachel. I have a question for you. I was wondering, there's a large area kind of where Texas and Mexico meets up, and you have the areas in El Paso, and you have a lot of displacement of tribes that have moved up from Chihuahua or moved down from the United States area, and you have all these people in these regions that have lost that identity to their home tribes. So how do you bring that kind of elder knowledge back to that and help those people who have been displaced to really come to terms with that intergenerational knowledge that they have?
Yeah, so I can't speak to that El Paso area or anything, but I can tell you that this is what we've been doing all our life. All of our, ever since we've formed Eloheh, is to help people find that again. And it's working. And sort of halfway through our journey, we realized it's not just for Native people, it's for non-Natives as well. I think that one of the statements, my brother Glenn, the Arapaho who was here, he said, he has white people all the time that come to him and say, "Can you teach me your ways?" And he says, "After you learn your ways, you come back to me and we'll teach each other." So yeah, it's important that we all connect to our and become more rooted in the land and in our own identities. Yeah.
One of my favorite moments of the whole weekend was when you talked about Abraham's story from pointing out different things that evangelicals and Protestants of many stripes don't see because of the emphasis on the land. And I'd like to hear more about stories in the Bible that you think we misread.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I just kind of brought that up as an accident, but I'm glad I had that accident. So, yeah, I mean, I was just trying to say that, you know, you can really use the Bible to justify anything, right? And so some of the early Puritans, like Cotton Mather, used it, and they would draw the narrative that said, you know, kill the inhabitants of the land, right? Rather than you know, what I feel is a better narrative, much more in line with the teachings of Jesus, which is to go as a guest in the land, to honor the host of the land, to give to the host of the land, and just, you know, treat the whole time with respect, even though the story says that God had told Abraham that he was going to give him all that land. And still, in spite of all that, he still acted what we would say in a good way. Yeah, hopefully that would be a more appropriate narrative. If you're trying to follow Jesus, you know, then that would line up with his teachings. Yeah.
I believe it was either Friday night or Saturday, you talked about some of the processes that we as white people could use from the Native American tribes. And I was just wondering where a source of that might be, and if you know of one or two things that we could start with right now.
So did I mention, you said process, what area are you talking about?
Well, for peacemaking.
Okay, yeah. So, I have done there's a place in Portland called the Peace House. It's people have been inhabiting it since the Vietnam War, and we talked about it because my friend Michael Ellick lived there, who was a UCC pastor in Portland, and they asked me to come present one time the Native American views of peacemaking, which we have lots in a lot of different tribes, right? And so I put together they taped it, and I think it's either on VHS or maybe it's a DVD, and I just need to upload it to our website, and I could make that available. But there's another documentary called, and it's named after a book, I think, You Chiefs Are Peacemakers, which would be relevant to you all here because it's about Cheyenne peace chief traditions. And they're very much in line with the teachings of Jesus. And if you were a chief in the Cheyenne tribe, you were a peace chief. There are 44 chiefs. And they were the ones that would try to remedy someone going to war, the young men or whatever going to war, and find alternative ways of solving that. So that would be another one. I think you can get that documentary from the Mennonite Central Committee. Yeah, so there's really no central place for all of these things. There's a really good website of the Boarding School Healing Project that has a lot about the residential schools and some of the wisdom that's come out of that. But you have to look around. We don't have a Holocaust museum or a genocide museum or a central repository for all of our stuff. It's just, scattered. So, might be a good doctoral project for someone to put together something.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the power of women in tribes, especially like the Iroquois, where our own women's movement took some of their examples, in other words, to, have some power in their lives too?
Yeah. Yeah, so in the one study by DeMaio I brought up shows that most of the tribes were more matrist in North America than patrist, and they were much more peaceful and remedied going to war a lot better and things like that. So it's a little different than we think today. So today it's like, well, a woman can do anything a man can do, right? And that's equality. Back in that day, it was like women had things that they did, and men better not mess with it, right? And so they had things that they would do. So, there were decisions that women made in the tribe and decisions that men's councils made. And so there was for example, in among my people, the Katua people, there was a council of 7 clan leaders who were men, 7 clan leaders who were women. The women had certain decisions that they made, and the men had certain decisions that they made. And it was seen as sort of like, but in most matrix societies, when it comes to family, the women basically ruled. So in Cherokee culture, for example, if a man came home and his goods, whatever they were, blowguns, clothes, etc., were set outside the door, that was called a divorce. And she had just decided that was a divorce. He also had to build her home in her clan village with her parents and relatives. And he didn't own the home, she owned the home. And the children belonged to her. And it was her brothers and her dad and her uncles who basically taught her children how to be a part of the system. And then it would be the husband's job to teach his sister's children and like that. So there's clearly an emphasis, we would call that a matrix society, that make more room for women in decision making than what you see in the West. And I think that was, it's not 100%. According to the study of DeMaio, it's about 2/3 of the tribes. And those were the tribes who were more peaceful, right? So, doesn't mean they never went to war. Just meant that they had a lot more remedies to prevent that.
Is there another question right here?
May I impose upon you to make a professional laugh gesture, please?
A what?
Laugh, L-A-U-G-H.
I don't get it.
I'm not sure can you say more, Charles?
Well, there's an awful lot of intellect on the chancel. I'd like to be able to understand a very common belly roll, no pun intended, to let us share to let us share a moment of exhalation, if you please.
I love what you said yesterday, I think it was, about how Indigenous people often like say, why do you take themselves so seriously?
Yeah. So we have a lot of fun together and laugh a lot, but you know, when you're put on the spot, you can't think of.
It's hard to laugh on demand.
So I can't think of one. Oh, I got one.
You started your sermon
I
before.
got one. If you got to hang with me the whole time, though. You ready? All right. Women, hang with me, okay? Huh? I don't know if it's appropriate. That's why I'm saying hang.
The bar is very low for being appropriate.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I better not tell that one. Yeah, I'll think of something.
Perfect.
Okay. I wondered if you'd been to the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C., and what you thought of it as being representational of the different tribes.
Yeah. So I've been to it twice. I went to it when it first opened, and with a couple friends of mine. And my friend Ray Aldred, who's a Canadian Cree, Plains Cree, we were walking out, he said, Randy, he said, you got more stuff in your home than they got here, you know. But I went back again years later, and, you know, it looks pretty good. They keep a lot of stuff in the drawers. You have to pull them out to really see. But it was also a sad experience because by that time, a lot of my friends who were elders had died, and there were 5 tribes. I think they rotate 5 tribes and in 3 of the 5 tribes, I knew the elders who they had pictures of who had all passed away. So that was a little bit sad, including my own adopted Kiowa mom and dad. So yeah, but I mean, I guess it's good. They don't really talk a lot at all about the residential boarding schools or missing murdered Indigenous women or any of the 60 scoop or any of those kinds of things that have happened. It's more just to educate people in general about who natives are now, I think, than anything.
And she's supposed to be your friend, man.
All right, I'll tell the joke. The only one I can think of right now is one my old friend Richard Twist told me. And all right, so I guess they were doing brain transplants now, right? Have you heard this one? No. And so this guy goes in. He wants a brain transplant, right? And so the guy says, well, you know, do you want a male brain or a female brain? He says, well, I don't understand the difference. He says, well, a male brain costs, you know, $1,000 more than a female brain. He says, why? He says, because it was never used. All right.
I think Ani Rose, it was great. Yeah, I think Ani Rose, you maybe have the last, or we're winding up on time.
There's 2 more people.
Okay, we can get those in.
Well, I had 2 questions. I guess I'll just ask one and then talk to you afterwards. When I read a lot of literature by First Nations authors, and I listen to John Trudell, Don Coyes, different big names, and there's some women in Boulder. I go to school at Naropa. It's very difficult for a white person like myself to figure out, are we all Indigenous because we all have ancestors somewhere, or not? Is it appropriating to say that? Or do I speak of my ancestry without using the word Indigenous? Is there infighting among Indigenous and whites about that? that definition. I wondered if you could talk to that a little.
Yeah. So I think you'll get all kinds of opinions about that. But in Becoming Rooted, if you read the introduction, which I hope you did because it's really important, that introduction. But I talk about the difference between small I Indigenous and large I Indigenous, which is just an easy way to sort of talk about it. And large I means the indigenous people of that land that you're on who've been working together as a group on that land since time immemorial. And small I Indigenous is people who are, basically transplants who are coming and trying to find their own indigeneity. And I mean, it may be, it's an alliteration, but I think it's important to remind us, like, we are not these indigenous people, but we are all supposed to be indigenous in some ways to the land and from somewhere.
Dave?
I'm going by just, you had mentioned earlier, you had mentioned the idea of Tony Hillerman being somebody that has done some work on understanding Native American culture. One of the things that in one of the books that I read was that there was in the Navajo, it said that in the Navajo tradition that they did not focus on punishment, but if somebody was acting in a disrespectful or not supportive way to others, that there was not a matter of punishment, but a matter of helping them to find that proper perspective for themselves so that they could relate appropriately to the rest of their tribe. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
It does, but I can't really speak to the Navajo system because I'm not Navajo, but I can say that in general among the tribes it's a much more emphasis on restorative justice processes than punishment. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I tend to see the positive side for everybody, but it isn't necessarily so that every person that's a Native American would be focused in that way.
No, and this would be among traditional people, and we've got we've all been colonized to some degree. A lot of our tribes have been super colonized, and so it's hard to make blanket statements, but in general, I know of a lot of traditional communities who are more interested in restorative justice, and I know examples of those in correction rather than punishment. And apparently, the penal system is not working too well for us, so we do need to find another way. Right?
Well, thank you.
Jim gets the last word.
So the Lone Ranger and Tonto rode into this valley.
Yeah.
And they looked on the hill on the left, and there were 1,000 Comanches.
Yeah.
Hill to the right, 1,000 Arapaho.
Yeah.
Down the valley, Comanches, and up the valley, Cheyennes. The Lone Ranger said to Tonto, "Looks like we've had it this time, Tonto." And Tonto said, "What do you mean, we, white man?"
So he knew a better Indian joke than I did. That's great.
Randy, thank you. Thank you. Edith, thank you both for being here, for sharing yourselves with us this weekend. We honor you. We're grateful.
Thank you for the invitation. For all your hospitality. Thank you.